Welcome back. Let's continue from our last video. In the previous video you saw when Layla discovered that Dane had chosen the autonomous major, her jaw nearly hit the floor. Eyes wide with disbelief, she stared at him as if he had just declared he was moving to another dimension. But what else are you even skilled at besides spearmanship and summoning? Dane only chuckled, the amusement in his eyes making it clear he had no intention of answering right away. Layla continued to shout, still unable to understand why Dane had chosen the autonomous major, saying she couldn't wrap her head around it and asking why he would choose that autonomous major. Dane simply replied that it was because he wanted to study that field. This only left Layla feeling more confused, reminding him that autonomous major had a very low acceptance rate. In response, Dane explained his reasoning, saying he had heard that with the autonomous major you could take any class you wanted, and didn't even need to choose a major until graduation, allowing you to learn all subjects with specialized instructors. Layla, already well aware of this, interrupted him, asking who didn't know that, and if he wasn't just trying to avoid studying alongside her by signing up for that major. Then she asked if he really thought he could pass in that field, wondering what he could do besides spear techniques, and summoning, her tone getting sharper, almost like an angry lioness, which made Dane hesitate for a moment, wondering whether to reveal all his abilities to her. The scene shifted quickly to a meeting with Professors Denevo, Professor Ingrid, and Professor Delfiniso, who were now discussing the results of Dane's test. Professor Denevo began stating that finally they had gathered everyone and that the autonomous major exam required passing 3 rounds, so it looked like he would have to participate in the exam. Professor Delfiniso added that spear techniques and core summoning magic were practically opposites, making it nearly impossible to pass both. She mentioned that some people had passed 2 rounds before, but most couldn't make it past the last one, wondering what he was thinking and glancing at her colleagues. Professor Denevo nodded in agreement, saying it was better to choose one between spear techniques and summoning, as you only needed to register for one. The 2 female professors sighed, noting that the autonomous major department had been established 200 years ago, but hardly anyone had ever passed. Back then it wasn't as difficult compared to the present day. The Academy's standards had risen, demanding talented individuals. Back in the Conquest era, every bit of talent was essential. Professor Ingrid, a bit curious, sighed and wondered why they kept the apartment open. Nobody applied and nobody passed, so why not just shut it down? Debo shook his head, explaining that it was symbolic, representing the most exceptional talents of the Althian Empire. Professor Delfiniso nodded in agreement, acknowledging its importance even though its prominence had faded, as it still carried weight. Professor Denevo then pulled out some documents, adding that he had looked into it and only 2 people had passed in the last century. One had dropped out and the other was a former emperor. Hearing this, Ingrid's face turned pale, worrying for Dane. She asked if that meant that if someone wasn't a genius there was no way to pass. Professor Delfiniso nodded quietly, adding that if he was from the Sogres family she was looking forward to seeing what he could do, as they weren't just any family. Professor Ingrid shrugged, saying that if it were up to them he could pass, but they had their positions to consider and couldn't afford to make mistakes. They decided to see how things played out, wondering if he had enough confidence to take on the challenge. The group murmured amongst themselves, all intrigued by the unfolding situation. Time swiftly passed and the scene shifted to the second examination hall, where all 3 professors were already present for Dane's evaluation. Standing calmly before them, the protagonist introduced himself as Dane Sogres, applying for autonomous major at the Royal Academy. Upon hearing his introduction, Professor Denevo gave a small nod and inquired if he understood what it meant to apply for this major. Dane replied with a respectful bow, stating that he had heard that one must pass all 3 stages of the examination to be accepted. It was then that Professor Ingrid, as if giving him a final chance, spoke up, confirming his name as Dane. She suggested it wasn't too late to reconsider, mentioning her great respect for Count Sogres, one of the finest men in the Althian Empire, and expressing her reluctance to see his son disqualified. Before she could finish, Dane interrupted her with a steady tone, thanking her for her advice, but stating that he had come there with the intention to give it his all. The resolute determination in his voice silenced any further attempts to dissuade him. Indeed, if he were the type to back down easily, he wouldn't have applied for this field in the first place. Realizing this, Professor Denevo sighed lightly before proceeding to explain the rules. He stated that the examination would consist of 3 stages, each tailored to his chosen major, and failing even one would result in immediate disqualification. These words were simple enough for anyone to understand, let alone Dane, who nodded firmly, indicating his understanding. Satisfied with his response, Professor Denevo turned toward Professor Delfiniso and said that they would begin with the summon trial as they had agreed earlier. At this, Professor Delfiniso, a woman with striking purple hair, calmly rose from her seat and approached Dane. From Dane's perspective, he had already heard of her. Professor Delfiniso from the summoning department was renowned as the highest-ranked summoner in the Althian Empire. It was said that she once set a record by maintaining control over 3 second-tier or higher summoned creatures simultaneously. So this is her, Dane thought to himself as she drew closer, his heart quickening with anticipation for the challenge ahead. He quietly acknowledged her impressive reputation in any regard related to summoning. Hearing her question, Dane didn't show much surprise. As expected, this was a free-form challenge with no specific standards or forms to follow. After thinking for a moment, Dane offered his suggestion, asking if she could summon a creature for him. A summoned creature? Delphinus asked as though unsure of Dane's request. Yes, any kind will do. Dane nodded again. Upon hearing this, the other two professors who had been watching from their seats nearly fell backwards in shock. What did he just ask the professor to perform a summoning? Ingrid said, stunned. Meanwhile, Professor Denevo, beads of sweat forming on his forehead, started to speculate about Dane's intentions, wondering what his plan was since there was no fixed format and thinking this could theoretically be explained as wanting to see a summoned creature up close. After a few seconds of contemplation, Professor Delphinus, although still unsure of Dane's intentions, nodded and agreed to his request, remarking that it was bold but interesting and that she knew this was not normal at all, so she must keep her eyes wide open to see what would happen. Saying this, she began to chant the incantation, and as her words filled the air, streams of energy light began swirling around. Eventually they gathered together, forming a spatial gate high in the sky. As soon as it appeared, a strong gust of wind blew through, causing several onlookers around to fall to the ground. From within the spatial gate, a massive wolf had emerged. This was a summoned creature with the head of a wolf but a body resembling that of a human. As soon as it appeared, it opened its mouth and let out a fierce howl, creating waves of sound that spread out around it. This was the frenzied summoned creature enRysei. Turning toward Dane and looking at the terrifying summoned creature before him, he was not only unfazed but even slightly amused. Such a chilling sound, he thought, noting that it was the most ferocious of all level 4 summoned creatures, infamous for attacking anything it saw. Since this was an entrance exam, he wasn't expecting much, but this was actually quite interesting. With that thought, Dane couldn't help but smile with excitement. On the other side, Professor Delphiniso also looked at Dane with an expression full of challenge and curiosity, asking what he was going to do now that she had summoned any creature he wanted. A few assistant professors who witnessed this scene widened their eyes in fear for Dane. enRysei was the most ferocious of the level 4 summoned creatures. Even many knights would have trouble defeating it in a one-on-one duel. What are they going to do now? Professor Ingrid said anxiously. Meanwhile, under the gaze of everyone, the young man began to slowly approach the giant wolf. This caused even Delphiniso, who had summoned the creature, to be shocked and try to stop him, asking what he was doing and telling him to stop before he provoked enRysei. Before she could finish her sentence, the giant wolf began to go into a frenzy, growling with terrifying sounds, seemingly warning Dane not to approach. However, the protagonist remained calm and continued moving forward at a steady pace, asking if it was alright as long as he proved it by any means. Yes, but if you prove it by putting yourself in danger, Delphiniso warned. But before she could finish her sentence, Dane interrupted her, confidently assuring her that wouldn't happen and telling her not to worry. As he spoke, he extended his hand slightly forward, and this action immediately made the giant wolf grow cautious. It continued growling fiercely, its eyes filled with madness, staring at Dane. However, for some reason, the longer it stared at him, the calmer its rage seemed to become, until it finally bowed its head in submission before Dane. "Good boy," he complimented, and the unbelievable scene left both Professors Denevo and Ingrid in disbelief. "What is going on here?" Professor Denevo muttered. Meanwhile, Dane patted the giant head of enRysei, remarking that it was bigger than Jinfu. As for Professor Delphiniso, who had summoned this creature, she knew it better than anyone else, making her even more unable to believe what was happening. "I can't believe it. I can't believe enRysei, known for its viciousness, is so easily submissive like this," she thought. She then suddenly realized that a faint blue energy thread was connecting her summoned creature to Dane. "Is that a magical tether with enRysei?" she wondered. It was faint, so it wasn't submission, but it completely erased enRysei's hostility, she whispered to herself, thinking this could be something extraordinary. Naturally, the other two professors could also see the thread. "Haha, even seeing it with our own eyes, we still can't believe it. Could it be an innate empathy?" They marveled, amazed at what they witnessed. Meanwhile, Delphiniso began analyzing how Dane had managed this feat, wondering if he had approached enRysei, quickly analyzed the magical tether, and then created a similar magical tether to connect himself to it. She thought that since there was no fixed method, this could be the most suitable approach to tame such a creature. His ability surpasses his mind, she recalled his master always praising him with. With talent like this, his future was indeed something to look forward to. With this thought, she took a step forward and confirmed the results of the test. "Dane Sogres, your abilities have been fully acknowledged. Strong courage, calm judgment, and solid basic skills. There's no doubt now you've passed the test." Nearby Professors Denevo and Ingrid also agreed with her. Upon hearing this, Dane gave a slight smile, thanking them. Time quickly passed until evening, and Dane was recounting the results of his test to Lila, causing her to be shocked. It had ended in just 30 minutes. She then exclaimed that he really was the valedictorian. Upon hearing this, Dane looked curious and asked what was wrong, mentioning that he had heard she was the top in swordsmanship. "No, you're the valedictorian," Lila shook her head and said. She then urged him to cheer up, reminding him that they had already thrown a celebration for their passing. Dane smiled in response, but Lila couldn't hold back her tears and began to cry, saying she wasn't hungry and that he should eat more. With that, she could only sigh, inwardly feeling devastated, thinking she couldn't believe there was such a huge difference. Thinking about this, she aimlessly wandered around while Dane, seeing her broken state, wanted to comfort her. However, before he could say anything, Duke Bout stopped him, saying she wanted to be alone and should be left to herself, assuring him that Lila would get through this. Then Duke Thermion paused for a moment and asked Dane if he had contacted his father yet, saying he was sure Count Sogres was very proud. Of course, Dane didn't need much reminding. He had already done it, confirming that yes, everyone was very happy. Hearing this, the Duke looked around at the people in the party and continued that if it was in the field of free autonomous major, then it was very well deserved. Everyone around them was surprised. Now that the exam was over, he told Dane to rest well and prepare for school. In response, Dane didn't forget to thank him, saying yes, thanks to his care he had had a great time. Then Duke Thermion seemed to recall something and asked Dane if he had thought about what item he would commission the blacksmith to make. Upon hearing this, Dane candidly shared his thoughts, saying he was thinking of a sword but didn't have any specific plans yet, as his body was still growing, so he wasn't sure what kind of sword to make and would think about it a little more since this was a good opportunity. Hearing Dane's explanation, Duke Thermion nodded as if understanding, saying there was no rush and to take his time. At that moment, a servant beside them spoke up, informing the Duke that it was time for him to go to the Duchess. Upon hearing this, Duke Thermion's expression changed to urgency and he said he knew and was heading there now. After saying this, he quickly left to meet his wife. Watching Duke Thermion's retreating figure, Dane guessed that the Duchess's illness seemed to be ongoing. Beside him, Lila explained further that luckily her symptoms hadn't gotten worse, but they hadn't improved either, and this had been going on for years now. Looking at Layla, Dane could only sigh inwardly, saying it was such a shame and that he had never had a family member fall ill, so he couldn't really understand how it felt. Dane then wondered to himself if he should go comfort Lila. Time quickly passed, and 2 days later, in the morning at the Royal Academy, the students who had passed the exams were gathered for the opening ceremony. At that moment, an elderly man stood before everyone and began his speech, stating it was a great pleasure to meet the new students of the Royal Academy, and introducing himself as headmaster of the Magic Academy, Arnold Homet. He mentioned that this year he had witnessed many new students who had passed the fierce competition and were now standing there, expressing his belief that the future of the Althean Empire would be very bright, as all of them were talented individuals of the Althean Empire. He further added that among these new students there were many exceptional talents, and in particular there was one student who had been admitted to the Autonomous Major program, a program where only 2 students had passed in the last 100 years. This student, he announced, had been accepted by the 3 deans of the Faculty of Divine Spearmanship, the Faculty of Magic, and the Faculty of Summoning. Upon hearing this from the headmaster, the group of students below began to panic and looked at each other, exclaiming in disbelief that someone had passed into the Autonomous Major and wondering who this incredibly talented person was. Turning back to Archwald, without letting the crowd wonder for too long, he immediately called out, asking the top student Dane Sogres to come forward and represent the new students. Hearing the call, Dane calmly walked forward, and as his name was heard, the surrounding students couldn't help but be amazed, wondering if that was the one who passed the Autonomous Major exam and what kind of blessing the Sogres family had received. That's a wrap. The story continues in my next video. Like and subscribe to stay notified.